and I wrote down a sports car, a Rolex, a Gamboni. Yeah. And I added a quote from the book for me to remember. Don't play games if you don't know the rules.
There's a fancy Wall Street guy working for a big investment bank, and he drives on a Friday evening his Ferrari home somewhere, and his car breaks down, and then he is stranded somewhere in a little village. He goes to an hotel, he goes downstairs, and there's a poker game going on. And he's, of course, a high-class rolling investment banker or trader, and he says, these locals, I will just kill them off. And he gets into the game, buys chips, and he starts to play. And the game goes back and forth for a while, and then all of a sudden he gets a very good hand, 4 aces or something. And he says, now I'm in. So he puts on his poker face and he starts to raising the stakes and then raise them some more. And long story short, finally it's even and the cards come on the table and he shows his 4 aces. And then the other guy shows a 2 of spades, a 3, a jack, absolutely nothing. So he wants to take in all the money. Then the other guy says, wait a minute, this is a Gamboni. I've never heard of a Gamboni. What is a Gamboni? Well, says that's the rule of the house. Look at the door, there is a paper, and there is description of what a Gamboni is. And he looks at the door, and then he says, that are the rules. So he loses all his money. He says, that's not going to happen again. So he puts in his Rolex and buys new chips, plays another game. The game goes back and forth for a while once again. And then later in the evening, he gets a Gamboni. And then, of course, he says, no, I have a very good hand. So he starts raising, puts in his Ferrari and everything. And then cards come on the table. And the other guy shows a pair of jacks, not too much. Then he says, I have the Gamboni. And everybody starts laughing and they say, look at the other side of the paper. And on the other side of the paper, there is the message, in this house, there is only 1 Gamboni permitted each evening. So he loses again. And that's the story. Don't play games where you don't know the rules.
Welcome to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest topic of all, money. How to make it, save it, keep it. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question, what it means to live a rich life beyond money. My guests share their practices, principles, and evergreen wisdom. I'm your host, Bogumil Baranowski, author, TEDx speaker, and investment advisor to wealth creators with patient capital and an infinite investment horizon. I work with families and individuals who aspire to grow wealth over a lifetime and generations through disciplined, thoughtful investments in durable quality businesses while giving money meaning. Join me on this quest to unearth and share the wisdom of the ages. Let me share with you the podcast program disclosure statement. Blue Infinitas Capital LLC is a registered investment advisor, and the opinions expressed by the firm's employees and podcast guests on the show are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Blue Infinitas Capital. All the statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. The information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. The information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. None of what you're about to hear is investment advice. My guest today is Philippe Gijsels. He's the Chief Strategist at BNP Paribas Fortis and the co-author of the book with Koen De Leus, World Economy in 5 Trends, Investing in Times of Superinflation, Hyperinnovation, and Climate Transition. How are you, Philippe? So nice to see you.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very happy to be here. I feel I've listened to some of your recordings and I already feel at home and I feel part of the family. So yeah, I'm doing well. Thank you.
I love the sound of that. That's the idea. I want my guests to feel comfortable and know that I greatly admire the book that you wrote. And I was very happy that I got to see it and read it ahead of time and we can talk about it. As you know, I manage money for families and I think about the long term all the time. And I call it the infinite investment horizon, a long-term perspective. And your book proposes a certain framework to think about the next 100 years, probably, or more. And it got me really thinking and got me inspired. So I'm grateful I have you here today. I do want to talk about the book, but you might know that I like to start these conversations with the early days. And I ask my guests, if they indulge me, about their childhood upbringing and how you think that time shaped you, your relationship with money, and the career path that you chose.
Yeah, I must say maybe I'm an only child, so probably I was spoiled a little bit. I started early in the business or in the stock market game because my father worked for the second largest bank in Belgium. So I went to work for the biggest bank in Belgium. I did not want to start out at the same bank as my father worked. And yeah, I've been talking about equities and options and everything since I was 12, 13 years old. So it was always at the dinner table we talked market. So I got a very early start. I made all the mistakes in the book, literally all the mistakes. So if experience is the sum of all the mistakes you can make, I have probably a lot of experience going on for me. So I remember the first stock I ever bought, and maybe you will not know it because it's an Italian stock, a European stock. It was Olivetti, and it was a typewriter maker at the time, and which turned into a computer maker, but it was not very successful. And I bought it at what I thought was a low point, and back then we had no internet. So if you want to have the history or of the time series, you would keep old newspapers, and then you would go and look at the high and the low of the stock prices. And I always thought you have to buy as low as possible because then it will has a lot of room to go up. But of course, it went belly up. So that was the first mistake. Don't buy stuff at the low. Start to buy things that are a bit higher. Then I thought, okay, it's not the stock price that I have to look at. I have to look at the valuation. So I started buying stuff with low PEs. So I thought, okay, that's, but then you, of course, only buy steel companies and so on. So that was not a good idea. And it carried on and on and on. And yeah, then finally, after many, many years, you come to something you can work with. And I remember, and I was thinking before the interview, when it was exactly, but I don't know, maybe I was 14, 15. I was at the beach in Belgium somewhere, lying in the sun with a horrible shirt. I remember back then, and then I was reading Reminiscences of a Stock Operator by Lefevre about Jesse Livermore.
Yes.
And then I started thinking, if I can buy something, and that something could be an equity, but it could also be a commodity or whatever, because he was dealing in a lot of commodities as well. And I can buy something at 10 and I can sell it at 12 or 15 or 20. Well, it's very nice. And that got me hooked on the markets. And then I also started to realize that it's not only about PEs and about calculations and balance sheets and income statements, but it's about philosophy, psychology, sociology, market history. Yeah, and I love books, I love ideas. So for me, everything comes together in the stock market, and yeah, that's what I've been doing ever since, basically.
Well, I can relate to that because when I discovered investing, and I was in Brussels, not far from where you are today, and I picked up a book, One Up on Wall Street by Peter Lynch. I got fascinated with the market, but as the idea of ownership of businesses. And I didn't think of it as I'll beat the market or become the richest person in the world. I thought it's so intellectually rewarding to try to figure this out. And if you're right some of the time and not too wrong most of the time, you'll be fine. And I haven't looked back since. I continued to explore, learn, and your book is one more addition to the large repertoire of sources that I found on the way that educated me. But speaking of your book, so the title is World Economy in 5 Trends, Investing in Times of Superinflation, Hyperinnovation, Climate Transition. Could you set the stage for us? What are we about to learn?
Well, I think I've written this book together with Koen De Leus, who's our chief economist. This is my first book. It's already Koen's fourth book or fifth book even. So for me, I always wanted to write a book. And since I'm not very disciplined, it was very good to have a co-author and to have a publisher to basically say, okay, now you have a deadline and you have to hand in stuff. So that's important. Koen, when we make a presentation, he always said jokingly, because we're always teasing each other, he always says he worked 3 years on the book and Philip has worked about 3 months on the book, which is true, a long summer. Not this summer, but the previous summer. But that's also because I have a lot of things already had in the drawers, text and ideas and so on. And I brought together a lot of things that I learned over the many years. And therefore it went from my side fairly quickly. And the reason for writing a book, because it's not just because I like writing and I wanted to have a book, which is fantastic, by the way, and you know the experience because you have written some of them as well. It was also the idea that the world is changing profoundly, and then probably the world we're going to have, or that we are having at the moment after COVID, is profoundly different from the world before. And it's not that COVID has changed everything, because a lot of these long-term trends would have happened without COVID as well. I think COVID was probably an accelerator to that, but it would have happened anyway. But a lot of our clients still thought and still think, but we try to convince them otherwise, that the world, when you look at the economy today, so the economy is slowing down, interest rates are coming down, inflation is coming down. So you could think, okay, we go back to a world where interest rates are back close to zero, inflation goes nicely below the 2%, commodity prices are not too volatile. So we're back in this period, let's say from 1982 until recently. And the big thesis of our book is we're not in that environment anymore. We're in an environment that resembles more the 60s and the 70s. And like Mark Twain said, history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. And it's not a one-on-one comparison, but we think that the world is profoundly different. And what you do in your work and in your books and with your clients is looking at generational shifts, at preserving capital for the long term, play the infinite game for the long term in a way. And I think that the rules have changed a bit. If you try to play this game today with the rules that were set in the last 30, 40 years, I think you're probably going to make investment mistakes. If you live in a world that's inflationary, by definition, it's totally different from a world that's deflationary or disinflationary. And one of the conclusions that we have is that you need to own real assets. And real assets is also what you basically buy when you buy a company or you buy a business or you buy an equity. You buy a real asset when you buy a home, when you buy commodities, when you buy gold, when you buy all these things, the real assets, because I think that money is going to lose value fairly quickly in the coming years, and that you're almost forced to be invested in all other stuff. And that's the main idea of the book, the main conclusion. But as you have read probably in the book, it's about life as well. It's about aging, it's about loneliness, it's about stories. But if you ask me for the thesis, the conclusion, the takeaway for clients, it's probably that.
When I'm listening to you, I'm thinking of fighting future wars with the weapons from the past war. Yeah, and I don't want to see investing as a war, but I think it's historically speaking, we've seen that happen, whether it was Napoleon or anybody else. They were trying to find the battles with the techniques from the past, and it's tricky to do that. And I feel like if you just draw your conclusions from the last 40 years of rates going from double digits in most of the developed world to zero, and you expect a similar setup going forward, and it's just one input from your book, you might be surprised. I think that's absolutely. The lesson.
And what I think is indeed, and probably is, back 1982, I was 12 years old. So my entire career, I've seen only lower interest rates. So there were, of course, times that it went up a little bit, but you went down the long staircase to the downside. And the younger people, they have never seen interest rates going up. A lot of people think that 4% that's huge, but they've not lived to the 15, 16% that you had at the beginning of the 80s. And of course, if you cannot draw from your own experience, then you have to start looking in history books and market history books. And that's something I think we should do. That's what Ray Dalio says, by the way. If you cannot draw on your own experience, you basically have to start looking in history books, and then you come to the 60s and the 70s, and then you come to the previous century and so on, and then you see this big wave. And this is a podcast, so I cannot show you a lot of charts, but I have a chart going back to 1870 of the American 10-year, and then you see these big waves. It's 31 years to the downside, 26 to the upside. After the Second World War, 35 years to the upside. Then after 82, 45 or so years to the downside. So, well, yeah, I think now you've started an uptrend here, and that will not be in a straight line either, but that's a totally different environment to work and to live in.
I'm curious about the 3 windows that you talk about in your book. Can you explain that framework?
Yeah, I love that framework. And we look at the world through 3 windows, and it's a little bit inspired on Microsoft, but with the windows, the sign, the logo. And the first window in my mind, there are only 3, so it's not really symmetrical. But the first one in my mind as a library. That's a bit what you see behind me. But I picture this is the mess. But I picture this as the library in the Starless Sea by Erin Morningstar. And Erin Morningstar, she has written 2 books, Night Circus and The Starless Sea, which are both fabulous. So we're waiting for the 3rd one. And it's a story about harbors under the ground with streams of honey. You have to read it. It's a fantastic story when you like fantasy. But there are really books, libraries everywhere in these ports. So that's my first window on the world, and that's all the knowledge you can find, in books, in research papers, and in everything that you read, history books, not only books about the stock market, but all kinds of books. So that's the first thing. I said, by the way, I wanted the book to be a combination between Erin Morningstar and Michael Covell. And Michael Covell is the trend following guy, which I like very much for what he's writing. And then the other one is more the literary side. So I wanted the book to be a combination of those 2. But the first window as a library. Second window, I see that as the coast. I like the coast very much. In Belgium, we're very close to the coast everywhere. And that's the waves. And then you already know where I'm going. That's the Bloomberg screen. That are the charts. That are the trends, the big waves that you see everywhere. And a wave can be very long or very short. You never know in advance, but you try to catch some nice waves. And if you are able to catch a couple of nice waves in your life, you're already doing very well. And the 2 things have to be in sync, because if here in my library, I'm studying and I come for whatever reason to the conclusion, okay, we have to own the biotech sector, just to give an example. But then you go and you look at the sea and you see that the trend is like this, it's going down like hell. Yeah, then probably your timing or your analysis is wrong. And then the 3rd one, and it's a very important one, I call this the Congress Center, but we could also call it a podcast or a community. That's somewhere where you interact with people. And both Koen and myself, we are lucky that we see our clients, and I see clients on the corporate side and on the investment side. And yeah, you have presentations, you have podcasts, but you have this interaction and you can test ideas. If Koen in this case says, okay, I think that the Belgian economy is doing fantastically, but you talk to the people of the port of Antwerp, or you talk to the big transporters and they say, we're not transporting anything, or order books are empty as possible. So that's also a contradiction. So these 3 windows have to be in sync, I think, to come to some sort of an investment conclusion or a strategy. And I like that. And I like all 3 of them. I like books, I like the coast and the waves, and I like the interaction. The best time of a presentation for clients is that when you're back sitting at the table or standing at the table and having a drink and talking. That's very nice. And you said in one of your previous episodes that okay, we talk for an hour or so. but you bring 100,000 hours or 10,000 hours of experience. That's exactly that. And the book starts with somewhere with Prometheus taking the fire from the gods, and then you have the campfires at the beginning, and it ends somewhere in the future. But even though in 20 years' time we will be able to do everything what we do today digitally, but there's still the need for interaction to be physically there, because at the end of the day we remain humans, and the discussion around the campfire after we have hunted the mammoth, well, that will never go away, I think.
You're touching on so many fascinating ideas, but the human interaction, I think there's so much truth to it, because I picture a doctor of the future. I had two doctors in my household growing up, my parents. And I thought that the new tools make the doctor better and more capable. But at the end of the day, you want the doctor to hold your hand and say, Philippe, we've done all the tests we have to do. We know everything we have to know. And we're going to go ahead with the procedure we talked about. And you could say, could AI do it for you and show up with a cold metal hand? And you and I know it wouldn't be the same. And it's the same with managing other people's money. It's a very intimate, very personal experience. It's very meaningful wealth to them. And they do want that hand. They want that voice, that presence to tell them, we've done all the work we have to do. These are the steps we're going to take. AI will never replace it.
And another element to that is they want to know that you're real, because they can create Bogomil or Philippe Gijsels virtually that maybe does not exist. And in 20 years' time, they will be able to do that nobody can tell the difference. So you have to show up in real life from time to time just to prove everybody that you're real. So that's also a point.
And have a heartbeat at the end of the day. But the other thing that you mentioned, the stories and the third window, and I'm thinking of my research and how I go about it. I talk to people all the time. And these days it's easier because it's virtual in many situations, but I want to know how things really are. And I feel like the aggregate statistics don't tell us the full picture, even more so now than ever before to some extent. So when people say, how is the economy? And you would say, oh, it's fine. Well, it's fine for certain income levels. For the other income levels, it's not so fine, right? And then as you mentioned, different regions of the country and then different countries in the world, when you say it's fine, because the aggregate statistic is 3.2 or 2.1, whatever we aspire to have, it's not enough. You have to know a lot more stories that a chart, a single number cannot represent, so that you have an idea that the low-income households are actually not doing so well. Those that had assets, appreciated assets, maybe are not experiencing the pain, but you have to have a much more empathetic human understanding of what is really going on. And you show up at the store and you talk to somebody and they say, well, half of the cars on the lot have no buyer, nobody's interested. That's more valuable to me than the 3.2 GDP growth statistic reported for the quarter for the year. I want to ask you about something I wrote down to myself and I smiled, and I think I emailed you at the time when I was reading that, but there was a story and I wrote down a sports car, a Rolex, a Gamboni, and I added a quote from the book for me to remember. Don't play games if you don't know the rules.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a story I borrowed from, I think, a book by a guy named Trader Vic at the time. That's already something that's 35 years old. And that's what I was saying. I've written this book fairly quickly, but that's an introduction I used maybe 20 years ago to start my presentation, to say, look guys, today we're going to talk about the rules, so don't play games where you don't know the rules. And the story goes like this: there's a fancy Wall Street guy working for a big investment bank, and he drives on a Friday evening his Ferrari home somewhere, and his car breaks down, and then he is stranded somewhere in a little village, and the car can be repaired, but it will take a while, so he has to stay there overnight. And he goes to an hotel with all locals and so on, and he sits in his room a little bit and watches television a little bit, but he gets bored. So he goes downstairs and there's a poker game going on. And he's, of course, a high-class rolling investment banker or trader, and he says, these locals, I will just kill them off. And he gets into the game, buys chips, and he starts to play. And the game goes back and forth for a while, and then all of a sudden he gets a very good hand, 4 aces or something. He says, okay, now I'm in. So he puts on his poker face and he starts to raising the stakes and then raise them some more. And okay, long story short, finally it's even and the cards come on the table and he shows his 4 aces. And then the other guy shows a 2 of spades, a 3, a jack, absolutely nothing. So he wants to take in all the money. Then the other guy says, wait a minute, this is a Gamboni. I've never heard of a Gamboni. What is a Gamboni? Well, says that's the rule of the house. Look at the door, there is a paper, and there is description of what a Gamboni is. And he looks at the door, and then he says, okay, yeah, that are the rules. So he loses all his money. Okay, he says, okay, that's not going to happen again. So he puts in his Rolex and buys new chips, plays another game. The game goes back and forth for a while once again. And then later in the evening, he gets a Gamboni. And then, of course, he says, no, I have a very good hand. So he starts raising. It's in his Ferrari and everything. And then cards come on the table. And the other guy shows a pair of jacks, not too much. And he says, I have the Gamboni. And everybody starts laughing and they say, look at the other side of the paper. And on the other side of the paper, there is the message, in this house, there is only one Gamboni permitted each evening. So he loses again. And that's the story. Don't play games where you don't know the rules.
I think it's very important, both in life and in investing, understand very well what kind of game you're playing. And you might be playing a different game than the guy sitting next to you. We've been reminded of that quite often. I'm fascinated with the concept of productivity. And you talk about it quite a bit in the book. And in my 44-year life, I've seen a massive change. And I'm thinking of my parents, grandparents. It's really a whole new world, how we do things, how we do business. Even you and I sitting here, virtually recording a conversation across time zones and talking about your book. There's a certain paradox there with productivity. You talk about it in your book. Can you tell us more? How should we look at what's ahead?
It's a very long story, so we'll try to cut it short because we can talk about innovation, and I know it's one of your favorites, so we can talk about innovation for a couple of hours. But there are a couple of things. First of all, if we look at these long-term trends, you have the aging of the population, the multi-globalization, you have the climate change, you have the debt situation. So these things are by definition all inflationary. So they have the potential to drive inflation and interest rates and so on way higher over the next many years. Innovation is the wild card because innovation is by definition deflationary. If you can do things in a more efficient way, in a cheaper way, in a better way, well, then inflation comes down. And of course, we have this AI story coming up. They talk about the new industrial revolution and so on. We will have to see whether this materializes. But that trend can, in a way, counterbalance the other 4 and can be even more powerful than the other 4. I'm a big believer in the super cycle in commodities, for example. And we position our clients in that direction. But I could be horribly wrong. And sometimes I hope I'm horribly wrong, because if this super cycle does not materialize, it means that we find a way to recycle, we find a way to make things cheaper, to use other materials. Because at the end of the day, what's innovation? What's progress? Well, that's finding a way to handle reality, the materials better. If you look at the world, it's all molecules and atoms and substances, except from some stardust that falls on the earth each and every day and every year. All the molecules are here. But what is progress? Well, we can arrange them in another way, and hopefully in a way that does not destroy the planet, but in a way that's better. So if we become better at that, I think, well, a lot of the other trends could maybe be not as negative as I see them. And in that way, it's a very positive book, because one of the stories we tell is we need wizards, and we need especially young wizards to find the batteries of the future, to invent the smart grid and stuff like that. And there I'm very optimistic that this can happen. So therefore, innovation is hugely important. Now, you're totally correct in saying innovation has been very disappointing over the last couple of years, because even though we had internet and so on, it never materialized in really higher innovation levels. Now the question is also, and that's something Koen touches upon in the book, how do we measure this? Because if you have, for example, an iPhone today and it costs a lot of money, or a smartphone or what have you, there is a calculator in that, there is a flashlight in that, there is a radio in that. So we do not need all that stuff anymore.
Right.
So probably the price of that iPhone, even though it's high, is probably less than all the components separately. But if you measure GDP, and what's productivity, GDP divided by the number of people or employees that you have, well, your GDP drops, even though you have something that's more valuable. So that's a difficult situation, but I'm an optimist. And also, if you look at the predictions of other banks, they predict that somewhere that AI will increase productivity. And that's very good news, because if you know that growth is productivity plus the population growth, and you know that population growth in a lot of countries will be flat or even very negative, it will have to come from the innovation. But yeah, I'm an optimist there in a way.
Well, if you look back, we've done an incredible job, and I'm very optimistic that there's yet more to do. And productivity is really fascinating because, as you said, it's very hard to measure it. Like how do you measure it? Because in a way, we're so focused on the output in how we measure things. Even when we watch a company, we want to see the higher sales, but we will be curious to look how they come about in terms of how many people are needed to produce it, how many hours, how many units of whatever inputs you need. And it's fascinating how the newer companies, and you mentioned Apple, in terms of sales per employee, right? It's staggering and unthinkable for a lot of businesses of the old economy. So it's fascinating what happens. I'll just mention one thing that somebody brought up to my attention at some point and told me about a washing machine, how we used to wash clothes by hand. And some people might still remember or know somebody at the dinner table, family table that remembers that. And now we have a washing machine, but the actual washing takes as much time because we wash our clothes every day or every other day. And we used to wash, I don't know, every week or every other week, or maybe when people were going to church or some celebration. So we have those moments where we have a leap and then we do more of it. And I'm thinking of writing letters. I actually wrote letters at some point in my life. And now I send sometimes hundreds of emails per week, just responding to people and clients and audience and readers. And I realize that the writing, if you just call the activity writing, right? Back in the day, I would write a handful of letters. Now I can write hundreds of emails, even if they're short. So productivity kind of reclaims the time in a new way because we get to do more of it. And I always wonder if we can ever escape it. Do you have some thoughts that we actually get? And I'm going to ask you about Keynes in a second, but he had this thought that in 100 years, we're going to be working, I don't remember if he said 10 or 15 hours a week because of all the productivity gains. You and I know that's not the case. We're still working the same hours that our grandparents did.
That was a part of Koen, and then we should mention as well that we do not always agree because the book is written as you do your podcast as a discussion. Koen and I, we discuss stuff, and some things, the big lines, we agree, but sometimes we do not agree. And we invite everybody to participate in the discussion because the future is by definition unknowable. So we just can have a best guess for it. So that's the invitation to have a discussion. And I think I'm more on your side on this one because I heard in your one of your previous podcasts that you have a way to have time blocks, that you do stuff and you work a long time on something, and then you have blocks to, if something comes up, to have time to do something. Well, I'm a horrible manager of time, so I have no control. I lost totally control about my timetable or my agenda. So I just go with the flow. But I can relate to what you say. I have the feeling that it's not going to get much better than by all the technology. I've got the feeling, and you're right, and maybe instead of writing 10 letters, you will do 200 emails or 500 emails, but you will still do that. And all the time that we spend, and that's also one of my nasty habits, being too much online and being on my phone and then my social media all the time, maybe I should find a way to, maybe I should read your books on that and everything, but to find time blocks to just write and think and read, because sometimes it gets overwhelming. So yeah, I could not agree more.
I'm curious about how the audience looks at it, but I'll mention very quickly, my grandma worked for most of her life as an accountant, and she left the profession before computers really took off. And she would ask me over the years, now that you have computers do all the calculations for you, what do you do with the rest of the time? Because she had to do it almost by hand. And I say, what rest of the time? Like that, there is no rest of the time. There's always something else. So we changed the method, but because we changed the method, it's just like the writing. The new method allows us to do it, 100 times more, and we never really escape it.
It's also a little bit the disease of the time, in the sense that we have to be busy, because if you're not busy, you're not doing well. You want to show your management, your clients, everybody that you're busy. You don't say, no, I've had a very easy day, a quiet day. I've read 2 books. You don't score points with that. And even that's probably better. Sorry, I interrupted you.
I'm sure we'll have a lot of innovation on that front, how to use our time. But we brought up John Maynard Keynes, and I smiled. It made me laugh because you have an interview with a famous dead economist with him. And at the end, towards the end of that interview, and I'd love you to introduce us to this interview. I don't know if it was you or your partner that did that interview, but there's a remark in there wherein Keynes says, your long term is a bit different than mine, which I find fascinating, because in investing, a lot of people say they're long term, and it means different things to different people. There's so much more in that interview. Can you bring to life Keynes for us for the next few minutes?
Yeah, Keynes, and then maybe some others, because we did the same with Ricardo and Malthus, and that's also a very nice story. But the point is, I did the interview because I always say I'm a little bit the shy guy, so I interviewed the dead people and couldn't interview the living ones. And we have 3 or 4 interviews like that, also with Schumpeter in a little theater in Austria. And Keynes was in a coffee shop in Brussels, and Malthus and Ricardo was in a little pub, the Old Bell on Fleet Street. And first with Keynes, and then maybe I talk a little bit about Malthus and Ricardo, because that's personally one of my favorite parts of the book, because I've written it, but I just love it. But with Keynes, okay, you have the interview, and then it goes back and forth, and the ideas, there are a couple of ideas in that. First of all, if you know your history, I find it always fascinating how people of the same age, but also over the ages, are in a way connected with one another. And at a certain moment, I asked Keynes to sometimes talk to Newton, the famous physicist, and that's well documented. Keynes, at a certain moment in time, bought the entire coffin full with research by Newton that the University of Cambridge did not want to have, because it was all the esoteric stuff, and they sometimes call Newton the last sorcerer, because he was a scientist and he's considered father of the modern science. So it was not very good to be in the esoteric stuff. So that was put aside, and Keynes bought that and eventually gave it back to the university, because then they wanted it after some time. And I say, do you sometimes talk to Newton? But there are more connections between the guys, because they both lost a very intelligent people, some of the most intelligent people that ever lived outside of economics, side of physics, but they both lost quite a bit of money in the stock market as well. So there are relations between them. And at the end of the interview, Keynes walks away, slowly and then suddenly, because in the previous part of the interview he said, you know how you go bankrupt? First slowly and then suddenly. So that was the word. But then he indeed talks about the long term, and we were talking about all the debt problems and so on, and maybe gold being a solution for the debt problems. And then I had the feeling, will it happen immediately? And he says, you have to have time, but your long term is not my long term. And that's what you talked about the infinite game. There you're playing an infinite game, because our infinite game ends in a way when we die, unless you can have the next generation that continues to play the infinite game. But for them, there is only the infinite game, so that's the long term. But if I have a little story on the other one, because that I absolutely adore. Ricardo and Malthus on Fleet Street, and it's back in 1815 somewhere. It's the Battle of Waterloo. And these are two characters. One is the professor, a little bit boring professor, that's Malthus. And then the other one is the very flamboyant trader, Ricardo. And the Battle of Waterloo is coming up, and they're quarreling all the time because they're also in different parties in the parliament. So they're quarreling all the time, but they're friends. And Ricardo thinks Wellington is going to win. So he puts a lot of money in the stock market and the bond market, and he even takes a position for his friend Malthus. But he is scared again, so he wants to get rid of it. Long story short, Wellington wins at Waterloo. Ricardo makes £2 million, so it was an absolute fortune back in the day, and the other one has nothing. So that's a little bit the story. But the point is, you can. I have the setting is a real pub. When you go to London, to Fleet Street, which is only, let's say, 200-300 meters from St. Paul's Cathedral, the pub is still there. So I went there, and I have left the book there. And I've written something in it, and I said, okay, thank you for having the interview with Ricardo and Malthus here. There is no other place in the world where this would have been possible, because that pub was already there in 1815 as well. So the book is there, and it's somewhere tucked away, and the code is 1666, because that's the date of the fire of St. Paul's Cathedral and the fire in London. And there's not a big use, but I like it because I know that the book is there physically in the world that we have created. So, yeah, there you go.
So you found a place in time and space where they both could have been.
Absolutely.
It's fascinating.
Absolutely fascinating.
Mm-hmm. It makes you think of, we're walking in the shoes, or we're standing on the shoulder of giants, as the saying goes. And it would be fascinating if a few of them could show up at the same time to join a conversation. I think it's a neat idea to see what they would say to each other, about each other, and the world that evolves around them. Fascinating. You bring up surfing metaphors in your book, and I surf, so I smiled reading those. And you introduce us to the alligator principle. What's that about?
Then we're talking trend following, and then we're talking a little bit less long-term investing, generational investing, but then we talk, you always have to try to cut a loss as quickly as possible. And you have to go with the long waves as long as you can. The idea is that you're surfing, and there's going to be a wave, and you have you're on your surfboard, and then the surf is coming up, and you take a very nice wave, but you never know whether it's going to be a big wave or a small wave. It can be a small wave that causes you losses, but it can be one of the waves that is making you quite a bit of money. And the alligator principle is the idea that you have to cut your losses short, because and that's a little bit a morbid story, I'm sorry for that, but when an alligator has you by the leg, you cannot do a lot. You can sacrifice your leg and try to get away, or you can try to get your leg back, but then it takes your arm, and eventually it takes your entire body. So when an alligator has you, and you are in a bad situation, and you're at a loss, the best thing you can do is cut your loss and swim away as quickly as possible, even if it costs you a leg. And that's the alligator principle, because otherwise the alligator will eat you entirely. So that's not a nice story, I know.
I like this story. I can relate to that, and I've seen places where alligators and crocodiles do swim out to the ocean where the surfers are. So there's a thought there. I have this idea of trying to be the least wrong. And even reading your book, I was thinking that it helps me to enhance this pursuit of being the least wrong. I don't have to be right, but I want to know of the things where I could be wrong about. And it's okay to change your mind if you're pointing the boat in a certain direction and the wind and everything else has changed, you have to point the boat in a different direction. I think in investing, especially if you are very vocal about how you think and what kind of ideas you're buying. I never talk about specific stocks for various reasons, but I feel like you have to have the permission to change your mind about things. And I think that's where you're going with it. Obviously, in a drastic way, losing a limb to an alligator. But sometimes you have to change your mind, and that's okay. It's part of the experience. I found another quote in your book that I actually brought up in one of the discussions here on the podcast with somebody. I paraphrased it and I mentioned your book. You say, and I'll just read the quote and I'll tell you what it is. You know what it is, but the audience doesn't know yet. Our earth is degenerate in these latter days. Bribery and corruption are common. Children no longer obey their parents. Every man wants to write a book, and the end of the world is evidently approaching. And you would have thought, you wouldn't, but my audience would think that I just quoted a tweet from this morning. But it's not. It's something that you found on a 5,000-year-old Assyrian clay tablet.
Yeah, indeed.
Right?
There's a lot in there, and that's why we put it. I don't know exactly in what chapter we used it, but the idea is that the more things change, the more they stay the same. So there is always these doomsayers, these false prophets that predict the end of the world. And in our world, bad news sells way better than good news, because maybe there was also a clay tablet back then with a positive message, but that's already long gone. So that's what you're left with. There are probably two or more, but the bad news always sells better and is always more inspiring in a way than the good news. But that's in a way the world we're looking at, and we tend to look at the world as linear as well, because we get born and eventually we die, so that's very linear. But a lot of these trends tend to be circular, and that means that a lot of things come back in the book. And then the book is a book about books, because I think it's maybe 100 or 150 books that we quote or that we try to draw inspiration from. A very nice one is The Fourth Turning by Neil Howe. Or The Fourth Turning is here because it's already an update. The original book was published about 35 years ago by Howe and Strauss, and unfortunately Mr. Strauss passed away in the meantime. But that talks about these long-term cycles, and therefore I'm maybe in the short run a little bit less optimistic, because I believe, I always say jokingly, you should absolutely read that book, The Fourth Turning, but should not do it under the Christmas tree, because it's sometimes a depressing book. You should not do it during your holidays at the beach, because it's too depressing. Maybe Halloween, that's a good time to read it, when things get a little bit dark, when the ghosts are out. That's a good moment. But it's a very good story, or very good analysis, because his reasoning is, okay, you have these long cycles and you have every time four in total, and this is the fourth, and four turnings together make up approximately 80 years. And there's a good reason for that, because if you have had something horrible like the Second World War, after that you start to build the United Nations, and then you say we're never going to do that again. But then after a while, everybody who has lived through all those difficult times has died or is extremely old, and then we forget. And then all of a sudden Gaza and Ukraine and everything is very far away, but it's not so far away. And that's a problem. So these things tend to come back, and that's what we're basically saying. These issues are always there, and it maybe also touches on a point. I write two things when I sign a book for somebody. Sometimes it's very personal. When I know the person in question very well, it will be more personal. But somebody comes and I do not really know him, I typically write, it all comes and goes in waves, it always does. And that's the song by Dean Lewis somewhere. It's a recent song. Or I write, this world needs more wizards and less prophets. And that are the false prophets that say the world is going to end, we're all going to die. No, let us try to find a solution. And like I said, I'm extremely positive and optimistic. I have two kids, 19 and 21 years old. If you see them, well, that's the future. in a way. And when we presented the book to the press, the kids were there, and yeah, that was a very emotional moment, because when you talk about the young wizards, well, you're talking about your kids and their friends. So it almost brought tears to my eyes. So that was a emotional moment.
But I share your thoughts and feelings about it because I'm very optimistic about the future. And I feel like as a species, we continue to find better ways to solve problems. Am I disappointed that we're dealing with some of the issues you brought up even now in the 21st century? Of course I am. But I'm very optimistic that in the coming years, we can find better ways to address all the issues and avoid conflicts and everything else that keeps us up at night. And I'm very, very hopeful when it comes to that. When I was reading that quote, I was thinking whoever was writing it out, carving it out really, they must have had a terrible day. That's one thing. And second, these days writing a tweet takes a fraction of a minute, but actually sitting down with that tablet, waiting for it to dry and carving it out, somebody really poured their heart out on that on that tablet. That's what I was thinking. It doesn't compare with a tweet, because a tweet costs no time to produce. This actually took an afternoon and maybe a weekend to produce. So I hope somebody had a better afternoon and the next day than whatever they wrote on that tablet. I want to ask you about the climate, which is a topic that comes up in your book, and I feel like we can't avoid it, and we can't avoid interest rates and inflation that I'm going to ask you about next. But you write about the disaster, you write about the opportunity, the potential winners and losers. And I wrote to myself reading this, we still only have one blue planet. I know people get excited about flying places, but a place full of water and life and the right temperature and still pleasant place to live, we have one of those. We haven't found another one, right? So, and you said something at the beginning that really struck a chord with me. You said how, the way I remember it, that all the minerals that have been on this planet, they are still with us, which also means that you and I are the stardust that ended up on this planet, right? So all the life that has ever existed on this planet is in the shape and form of life today, right? So we have this continuity. We talk about family wealth, but this is like evolutionary, biological, mineral continuity on this planet. And it's still one planet. Talk to me about climate. I want to be optimistic on that front.
Yeah, indeed. So I could talk to you for a couple of hours about the secular bull market in commodities. And that's something I strongly believe in, but this goes way deeper. The point that you make, indeed, with the molecules and so on, it's a strange feeling to know that some of the molecules in our body somewhere were in the tail of a dinosaur, maybe not so long ago, or somewhere very deep in space with the Big Bang, and then that's what we are. So that connects us with the entire universe. And once we start to realize that, and then I'm sorry that I get a little bit metaphysical on you now, but I think in one of my next books, I'm going to write about quantum physics and about quantum computing and so on, because if you start to think about that in a way, we're all part of the same molecules, we are in a way connected. And that's very important. And that's what quantum physics is about, in a way, that our mind is somehow connected to the universe and there is a collective memory or something like that. So that's maybe one of the evolutionary steps we have to take, understanding that, and that will solve a lot of problems. Now, in the short run, of course, the climate change is there and the climate change is real, and we have to deal with that in a way. Unfortunately, it's very much connected to other things. It's connected to politics, geopolitics, because if you spend a lot of money on the climate, which is probably necessary, you will increase the debt, that will increase the interest rates, that will feed into populism. So you have to be able to make the changes in a way that you do not cause other things, because the laws of unintended consequences tend to be very large here. So and there are a lot of limitations in all directions. So and then we come back to what we said before. We come back to the innovation and so on. We desperately need better batteries. We desperately need smart grid and all kinds of inventions. I say, and I hope I'm right, I'm not even sure about it, but I always say the next Apple or the next Microsoft might be a battery company, or maybe it's one of the big guys that invents the battery, because the progress in battery technology has not been fantastic. It's not, unfortunately, not like in biotechnology, not like in semiconductors. It's not following Moore's law at the moment. So the progress is fairly slow. And that's a problem. You need to go faster. But the problem with battery technology is that you have to simulate a lot. And then, you get a lot of dead ends and so on. So you can hope that with AI, in a way, we can start doing that in a more efficient way. But that's where the progress needs to be, because I also tell the story, and it's a long story, so I'm not going to tell all of it, and people still have to read the book as well. But when you look, you have the return on investment. We all know that you have 100, it goes to 105, you have 5 on 100, you have made 5%. But you have something like an EROI, an energy return on investment, and we have always progressed from the earliest times when you had a tribe and they made spears and they went to hunt the mammoth, killed the mammoth, cut it up, brought it back to the village, cooked it, ate it, and then digested it. How much energy you put in that and how much you get back. And that was about 5 or so. And 5 is 500%. If you would say, okay, I give that to a client as a return, he would be extremely happy. But that's 5, that's the world that we had until the Industrial Revolution. And then you start to burn coal, that's 15. It's very polluting, but okay, if you have progress, you can do other things. Inequality, because in all these transitions, typically you have inequality. Then you go to oil, 25. Uranium, nuclear is about 50. And I've not named the figure because all the figures that I've given until now, that's documented, that's researched by somebody else. So I did not want to put a figure on solar and wind. But suppose, and I think that's very possible, that's below 25. That would be the first energy transition that you do where you do not go to a higher EROI. And that means that the cake gets smaller. And the cake gets smaller. And when people are already fighting to distribute it, it becomes nasty. So we have to get this EROI of all these alternatives quickly much higher. And that would solve a lot of problems. But we can only hope that not enough money goes to that, enough investments are made, because this is hugely important. And I think eventually we will get there. But once again, in a world of a fourth turning, where there is not a lot of understanding between people and countries, it will be extremely hard. But we can only, as a bank, we're very much behind the transition. We try to look at investments that are not too harmful for the planet. We try to find solutions, but it's an uphill battle, unfortunately.
I have so many thoughts, but I'll mention two. One, when you said batteries, when you think of fossil fuels, this is all the solar energy that was captured by the earth over millions of years, and through all the complex processes was kept in the form of coal or oil or natural gas. But it's really the equivalent of a battery that we are tapping into. That's the energy that came to this planet long before us, and maybe long before most of the life that we're familiar with. And second thought that I had was the COVID years. And I do vividly remember those stories when we're all sent home around the world and we had to work from home, study, go to school, interact with our teachers from home. We basically stopped flying, moving, driving. And the world, the planet, started to immediately change. I'm sure you've heard those stories about fish in clear water in Venice canals. Yeah. You might have heard the story of the snowy owl that decided to show up, a pair of them, in Central Park for the first time in over 100 years. It's a bird that doesn't like attention and company, and the park was so quiet, and the city was so quiet. You can imagine the middle of Manhattan, to the point that the snowy owl decided to show up as a mating pair, which is even more intimate for them. And millions of other stories happen at the same time. And I thought, maybe it's a glimpse of a solution. I don't know if it's the solution, but a solution. That look, maybe if we're moving around less and we do it more intentionally and with purpose, maybe driving to work 30 minutes every single day and driving to a store 5 times a week, if we all cut it down to some extent, maybe the planet will say thank you, and we will say thank you back for having us here. But that's my optimistic thought. I want to ask you about interest rates because it's a topic we can't avoid. And I see the interest rates as the ultimate price of everything. It's the price of money over time. And you call it the time machine. And I love that reference, time machine. And you add that the interest rate cycle is more important than the economic cycle, and inflation and debt are somehow intimately connected to the topic of interest rates. How do we go about understanding what's about to happen in the next few decades?
Yeah, there is a lot to unpack and everything that you say here, and every word has its meaning. So indeed, I try to break it down a little bit, and when I forget something, please ask me again, because you asked quite a bit of things that are important. First of all, and that's just an observation. It will become more vague as we progress, but that's an observation. If you look over the years, stock markets are way more correlated with interest rates than with the economic cycle. Maybe not correct, because interest rates also depend on the economic cycle. But what I want to say is that if you would have bought equities in terms of timing each and every time the economy was doing well, and sold them at the moment that the economy was going to a recession, you would have done very poorly. So stock markets are not correlated very well with economic growth, but they're very much correlated with the interest rates, because in our world, and I often make that reference, interest rates are like gravity. So when interest rates are low or negative, there's almost no gravity. You're on the moon or some other planet, and you can make giant steps and everything can fly. That is the moment that commodities go up and gold goes up. Even gold, which is very heavy, can fly. Stock markets go up, art goes up, wine goes up, old-timers goes up, all the real assets. So that's the point. And then, of course, when gravity comes back, typically when the economy does better, interest rates start to go up, and that typically kills the cycle. So if you would have invested over the last many years, and each every time that the stock market was in turmoil because we were going to go into panic, maybe the situation where we are today, but the situation is more complicated today because you have this tug of war again between recession or no recession, yes or no, slowdown, hard landing, soft landing, but somehow the economy is turning down. I think everybody agrees about that. So that's not good for corporate profits, but it will mean that the Federal Reserve, and also as a consequence probably a lot of other central banks around the world, will start to cut interest rates. So the economy will come down, gravity will come down as well. So that's maybe not a bad outcome. So that's one idea. So this inflationary thing is very important, and this interest rate thing is very important. Now, if you believe, as we do, that we will have a world where interest rates will be structurally higher for the next 20, 30 years, then of course it will also mean that you will not have the walk in the park that we had in terms of stock market performance, because we had so many crises. We had the internet bubble of 2000, we had the real estate, we had the global financial crisis 2008, 2009, we had the COVID. But to all these crises, the S&P 500 and the Dow Jones, they kept setting new highs. Back in 82, the Dow Jones was at 1,000 points, and now we're at 40,000 points. So that's huge. If you take one step back and you go back to the inflationary period before, let's say from 64 to 82, well, in 64, the Dow was also 1,000 points. And in 82, the Dow was also 1,000 points. And in the meantime, you had a lot of inflation. Of course, you mentioned Peter Lynch. And I've read that book as well, One Up on Wall Street. I found a fascinating book back in the day. It's already also 30, 40 years old, the book. So good books last forever in a way. But he made, of course, his reputation making money, buying good companies in an environment where the stock market did not go up. And I'm not predicting, because I cannot predict anything. Nobody knows. I'm not saying that the stock market is not going to move for the next 20 years, but I'm saying the headwinds will be bigger. And secondly, being a stock picker and buying the right stuff will once again be rewarded, because if everything goes up, it's fairly easy. You just buy the index and you just wait. It has been a horrible couple of years for stock pickers because you had to be in the Magnificent Seven, and whatever else you bought, you were lagging. Well, I think this world is going to change. So there will be headwinds, but as always, there will be opportunities. Maybe one final thing, what you mentioned, the time machine thing. You all know that when you have a cash flow today, or you have a cash flow in 20 years, it's not the same, because you have to calculate it back. If you have to have money today and you would have interest rates over the next 10, 15 years, you have interest, well, the sum will be higher in 15 years' time. The other way around, if you calculate it back to today, you have to discount it. And the discount factor is, of course, inflation. And interest rates, depending on inflation, but interest rates. And there it becomes interesting, because when you have a company that makes cash flows today already, you're much less vulnerable to rising interest rates. When you are a real estate company, or even better, a biotech company, it's investing a lot of money today, and the profits or the returns will only come when you have invented the thing and sold the thing in 15 years' time. Well, it suffers way more. And that's where alternative energy comes in. Because if you look at alternative energy stocks like wind and solar and so on, if you install a windmill or you put solar panels on your roof, you have to put down the investment immediately, but you will have the return over the many years. And it's a big difference if you calculate this cash flows back at 1% interest rate or at 5-6%. So in a way, alternative energy stocks behave like biotech companies. And that's something we have to know. If interest rates go up, there will be sectors that will do better and sectors that will suffer less because they have the cash flows immediately.
No, it's fascinating. I wrote down, as I was listening to you, brought up the fact that every time we had a crisis, we came out of it, and the Dow or the S&P or everything else basically went up. Not everything. Japan has struggled, and some other markets have struggled, but the US-centric part of the world has done well. But we did it, and you and I both know it, with low rates again and more debt again. So we haven't found a solution. It wasn't a productivity leap. To some extent, maybe it was, but you can't explain all of it through productivity leap. That's one thought that I had. And a lot of people, when they talk about interest rates and this phenomenon, they focus on the assets and the asset prices. Higher multiple, basically, and that we're paying for the earnings, corporate earnings. But I think not enough attention is given to the inflated demand. And here, just a simple example of car ownership. It's not even ownership these days in the US, it's leasing. So you show up and you don't even ask how much is the car, and it's 30,000, 40,000. You ask how much it is per month and what the terms of the lease are. So it's a renter's market, right? So what it tells me is that people that show up, they first of all buy the top of the line car they can't really afford to buy. They lease it, and it creates this artificial demand, and the average price of a car sold obviously goes up. So if you want to buy a car manufacturer, you are under the illusion of how well they're doing. We're talking about the output and consumption, and the supply goes up because the demand goes up. But if you took into account that the low interest rates and availability of credit creates, I'll dare to say, fake demand, not sustainable demand, then if you take all of that out of the equation with higher interest rates, some fascinating things can happen. A reallocation of assets and consumer choices. But that's another book. we won't explore it, but I wanted to bring it up because it was on my mind as I was listening to you. I want to bring up globalization, and you talk about multi-globalization. And in that context, you talk about the unique position that the US has. And you're going to smile, laugh maybe, but in grad school, I went to grad school in Paris. We had to give this talk at the end of the day of the school, and we were pulling out of a hat or a bin a topic, and my topic was the United States and globalization, and that was some 20 years ago. So I was reading your book, and I wish I was reading this chapter before I gave that talk 20 years ago, because you have some thoughts about the more connected world, shrinking in many ways. And you do highlight that the US has the best location and the dollar is still the world's reserve currency. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the United States, so you will hear that hear that in a second. They always say the 21st century will be the century of Asia. And I'm very willing to believe that, but I think that the good old US of A has still quite a bit going for itself. Demographics, for example. If you look at Europe, if you look at China, if you look at Japan, you have very fast aging. The working population is going to shrink. In the US is going to be stable or even going up mildly. There's a table in the book which has all the different countries and the estimates for the population in 2100. So demographics are way better. But you refer to the geography, and there we did a thought experiment, like we do quite a bit in the book. Even if UFOs land on Earth, what's going to happen to the Nasdaq, for example? So sometimes it's all out of the box. But this one, we go back to Pangea. That comes down to what you said before, the dinosaurs and the molecules and everything. So 350 million years ago, you had one supercontinent before the continents were drifted away from each other. So everything was packed. And then the question is, if this would be the world today, and we projected all the countries today on Pangea, where it is, and then you ask who's benefiting from this and who is doing a very bad deal. And then you see that, for example, Antarctica and Australia, all of a sudden they have neighbors. Okay, maybe they would like to have neighbors, maybe not, but okay, you could say that's maybe not so sure whether it's positive or negative. But for example, Brazil is in that world landlocked. Now they have about, in the real world, the world we have today, 5-6 very nice ports. Well, all of a sudden you cannot transport anymore. Saudi Arabia, the same. But the worst deal on that map, 350 million years ago, is probably for the United States. Because all of a sudden it's I can try to describe it, it's on the top left-hand side somewhere. But the point is, it's connected. So all of a sudden on the eastern coast, where now is the Atlantic Ocean, you have a lot of neighbors, most African countries. And the big advantage in geography of the United States is, of course, in Canada, there are not a lot of people and they're friendly. You have in the south also friendly people, Mexico, but you won that war already many years ago. So on the continent, there is no competition. Yeah, you have maybe Cuba, but okay, it's too small to be really a problem. So you have the hegemony on the continent, and you have, of course, two oceans, the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean, the strongest fleet. So the United States can invade anybody who wants to invade, but nobody can invade the United States. And that's a huge advantage in geography. Also the Mississippi. You have the stories of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn and the riverboats. So from the Corn Belt to New Orleans, very nice way to transport. So if you look at geography, you could have not found a better place on Earth with the rivers, with the oceans, also with all the commodities, because don't forget you still have a lot of commodities. You're not mining them, but you have a lot of commodities in the ground. So, okay, we have some turmoil, we saw the debate not so long ago, complicated story as well. The elections will be complicated. But I think the United States is still very well positioned in very many ways. And also for the reserve currency, of course, because they all say, you have a debt of 35,000 billion, 36,000 billion, you pay 1,000 billion in interest rates on that. That's higher than the defense budget. So we can start to make up quite a bit of horror stories. But the bottom line is, what's the alternative for the dollar? Okay, if you think that the entire financial system is going to fall, okay, you're in gold probably, but for the rest there is no alternative for the dollar. For example, there are a lot of countries that try to get away from the dollar in a way, and let's take Saudi Arabia and Russia. They do business together, and they want to get rid of the dollar, so they do it in another currency or whatever they want. But as long as there is no trade surplus and the trade is in balance, there is no problem. One country gives goods, receives goods from the other one. But suppose that Saudi Arabia gives more goods or sells more goods to Russia, all of a sudden they have rubles. What are they going to do with the ruble? They can buy Lukoil. They can buy an apartment in St. Petersburg, or they can say, I do not trust the ruble too much. I convert it into dollars and I buy some real estate on the East Coast, or I buy some Nvidia. And you can trade in whatever you like, but if
Yes.
you're not willing to hold it as a store of value,
Mm.
it's useless. And I see at the moment not a lot of alternative for the dollar. So even though there are issues, there are geopolitical issues, there are political issues, there are debt issues, I still think that until further notice, the dollar is still the reserve currency.
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with you. In my book, Money, Life, Family, I talk about the location and I talk about the US and I explain why it's the most favorable I can think of in terms of a larger economy. You might find a smaller nation out there that maybe has sorted out some things better than the US, but speaking of a large economy where you can sell a lot of services and products to and have a big market and a diverse market, it's the structures, it's the system, it's a lot of things. You mentioned something in your book that people go places, and you mentioned China, and you reminded me of the story. Remember that the rules of the game might not be the same when you go places, and I think it's an important reminder when people are sitting at the top of a high rise in New York making decisions about something that's happening on the other side of the world in terms of investments. And I've been a part of those conversations, and I asked them, "Have you been there?" And they say no. I think it would be helpful to go there and have dinner and lunch with somebody that lives there and understand that maybe the Gamboni story becomes very relevant. So you're not playing by the rules that you know at home in a place where there are different rules, and especially if you are from abroad. So that's something that I like to remember. I want to ask you about demographics, and you kind of hinted that US has favorable demographics, but big picture, the world. And as I was reading your book and getting towards the end of the book, I was thinking interest rates, the climate, the global trade, and everything else, and I can worry about all of it. But at the end of the day, with aging population, what will happen? There's no one left on the planet. Everything else kind of fades away. And I wrote to myself and I wanted to ask you, do you see a power shift in the sense that the money will follow the people?
That's a good question. And I do not have a clear-cut answer to that either. It's difficult because if you look what's going to happen demographically, it's fairly clear in a way, because demographics is the part of economics where you have the best predictive power, because if you want to have the working population in 20 years, those people are already born. So you have a view on that normally, and United States is still doing reasonably fine. You have an increase in the population, depending on the immigration, of course, because you have to make all kinds of assumptions. And now it's about 900,000 people coming from Latin America. And then you have a small increase in the population in total. If you double that, you have another story. If you lock the border totally, you have another story as well. But with the assumption that we have, it's still doing fairly well. Europe is a catastrophe. Belgium, where I live, is still more or less okay. We will also have the same amount of people in 2100, but the rest of Europe, Germany and Italy and so on, they will lose about 30 to 35% of the population. Japan, they're slowly dying off basically because their population will be cut in half. China is a disaster as well. One of the big blocks where it's doing well is India. India will still has the most people in the world, no more than China, so they will still grow for a while. But the place where you have the most population growth is, of course, Africa. Africa today has about 1 billion people. In 2050, it will be 2 billion, and in 2100, it will be 4 billion. So that's the only place, and that also depends, of course, on births and deaths. But okay, that's an estimate. But even when you're off a little bit, you see where the population growth is. Question is, will the money follow that? Well, then you have the issue of political stability. And if you once again, and that's why I'm a big believer in the United States with the deep capital markets, the stock market, the free market system, if you look at the percentage point of the world economy that the United States is, and what the world economy is, well, it's getting an ever smaller part. Because emerging markets, they went from 40% of the world population and the economy, logically, to 50 to 60. and in 20 years' time it will be 70%. But if you look then at market capitalization, emerging markets have been disappointing for the longest times, and that has to do to a certain extent with political stability, and where do you want to put your money, and where do you want to keep your money for a couple of generations. And like you said totally correctly, there are probably smaller places in the world that do even better, but if you want to move big capital flows, you have to go somewhere, and then the United States is the issue. Africa is a big question mark, I hope, because we're very close to Africa and Europe. I hope you find a solution for that, and you can start building, because you can have a very optimistic story. One chapter that did not make it in the book, because at the end, you know the drill, you have to take out things, and that's always very painful because you have to kill your darlings. But we wrote a little bit more about Africa, and that maybe the next Einstein or the next Mozart will come from Africa. And when you have big cities, a lot of the big cities in the world will be in Africa, 10 million, 20 million, 50 million people. It's a little bit our job or responsibility to see whether that are real cities where creativity can be created, or it will be a collection of slums, because then it's not going to help. So there is a big question mark there. Demographics are extremely important. They always say, even a movie, the hand that rocks the cradle controls the world. Well, that goes a little bit in that direction. So there are massive opportunities, but also massive risks. Now, another thing is, you say we're all going to die off and the population will come down and so on. There is also the longevity story. I'm a big believer in the fact that we will live longer and we will live healthier. And there are a lot, and cannot indicate all of them, and it's not a podcast about investing, but if 20 years ago you would say, oh, you're going to benefit from the aging population, all fund managers, and they had funds about it, they would say, buy golf courses and buy cruise ships. That's it. And that's not how it's going to be, because there will be long life learning, there will be mentorship, there will be things. We have an idea about a career. We call it a transitier, because career comes from the Latin word carus, and carus means car, and the idea is to move from one place to another, but more or less in the same direction. Transitier is what we invented, a word that we invented, and also comes from Latin transitus, and transitus also means going from one place to another, but also in different directions. And our system is not built to start again with a new career, but if you're going to live 120 or 130 years with all the debt that we have, it's not possible to retire at 60. So your working life will be way longer, but it also means maybe you're going to do different things, because in your entire life you will have so much technological process that you will have to learn your entire life, but also possibly that you're going to do something else. So there are a lot of opportunities here, but demographics is it's a very interesting point.
Again, I have so many thoughts, but I'll mention just two. One, you talked about longevity. I read a book. It's called The Book of Charlie by David Fundrella. It's a story of a real person, a doctor that lived in the US in Kansas to 110 or 109 years. And in that book, he beautifully tells the story of his life, but also the world that has changed around him, and how Charlie reinvented himself. It's a real life character. Throughout his career, continued to get new education as a doctor, as a physician, as he lived from the invention of penicillin to very sophisticated tools and medicine that became available throughout his lifetime. Even when he retired, he would still show up and see doctors to keep up with what's changing. And I think he actually was retired longer than many people work, which is a fascinating phenomenon, because we have so many systems built with some assumption how long retirement lasts. But what if we're going to stay in what we consider now the retired years longer than the original productive years? Wouldn't it make sense to be productive in some way too? I don't know. I think there's some ideas around it that I think are worth exploring that you brought up today. And I want to mention that when I look at US companies, I invest in stocks, public markets, and I realize, and you know that too, how many of the US companies and large, maybe Swiss companies and a handful of other markets have a global presence. And in some cases, they actually have better margins overseas than back home. So you could participate in what you mentioned, the booming demographics in many places, but with the protection and the structure of the US laws, the US disclosure, the US shareholder culture, and on and on and on. So you own the Coca-Colas of the world, but you really have some sort of a reach and collect pennies from around the world, right? So when you look at your dividend, I don't know, $2. Think of it that a couple of cents came from Africa, a couple of cents came from South America, a couple of cents came from Australia, and so on. So you don't have to be physically present. You can be present through this kind of a channel and benefit more than the emerging market investing that you mentioned when you own the local businesses that might not have delivered on the promise that we've had. But that's yet another topic. I want to ask you, before I ask you the very last question, about what I wrote down, the day after tomorrow story. You have it at the end of your book, and I'm not going to give it away. I'll just mention what I took away from it. It's that what you brought up earlier. The more the world changes, the more it remains the same. So I have a question about this story, the day after tomorrow. I don't know if it's 20 or 30, 40 years from now. What don't you expect to change at all in the coming decades? We've been talking about the change, but what do you think will remain absolutely the same?
Well, the story is, and I can give some of it away, it's a story about Koen and me. We very often do presentations together and we drive together. I'm a horrible driver, so I'm very happy that I can drive together with him, or he drives, and I'm in the car, and I cannot wait for self-driving cars and flying cars and so on, because that would solve a lot of my problems. But then we can imagine we're in a self-driving car, and then we're on the road, and there is a traffic jam, and then the car says, "Do you want to fly?" Okay, and flying has a couple of consequences. First of all, it will cost you more, but it will also cost you more in terms of insurance, because when we're there, you have your insurance policy, but each and every time you do something risky, immediately it charges to your policy. So okay, we drive and we fly, and then we fly up and we see the traffic jam below, and we see that they're actually coming to our presentation, and that's something I borrowed from the famous guru who says he was in an helicopter, and then he says, downstairs there is a traffic jam, but then he realizes, they come to my presentation. And the idea is, and we started the book, like I said, with Prometheus, with the fire, the campfire, the mammoths, and then you go 20, 30 years in the future where you can do anything digitally. You have holodecks, you can have a room like in Star Trek, and where you can say, make me a salon in Paris with the philosophers, and you can do everything of that, but still at the end of the day you want to go back to the campfire, and you just want to go back to talk to the people physically. That's the third window, the Congress Center, where you actually meet and you can bounce around ideas. And I think the more things change, the more they stay the same. With the clay tablet, these things are not going to change, because we remain humans, and humans thrive on stories, on ideas, and so on. And that's never going to change. So I'm not so afraid that you or me were going to be replaced by some AI thing, because they can project us. It will be hard to see the difference, but the storytelling and so on, and the interaction, I think that will remain. And that's at the end of the day a very positive story. And at the end there is a song that I love by Billy Joel, Piano Man. That is the idea of a bar, and that's the song we play in the car. That's the song of being somewhere. And then there is a line in that song, they have come to see, to forget about life for a while and have a drink. And I think that's never going to change.
I love the sound of that, and we talked about it throughout this conversation, that human touch cannot be outsourced or replaced by technology, and we will have more powerful tools to do the things we do, whether we're doctors or investment managers or whatever else. But at the end of the day, the human interaction is very meaningful. I'll just mention one thing, that there are tools these days to generate your voice, AI, and they're getting pretty good. And actually, for the purpose of this podcast, I tried it. I never broadcasted it. I showed it to my wife, and she said, "It's you, but it's not you."
Yep.
and there was no soul in the voice, and we both couldn't tell. But it gave us both chills because that voice sounded like me, but we both knew it's not me. But on a human level, you talked about being real. We pick it up, and it might be, all our millions of years as a species interacting with each other, we pick up on the authenticity of the other human. And AI may trick us, but on some level, it will feel that I'm not interacting with Philippe. So I'm very grateful I got to interact with you today. But I want to ask you one last question before I let you fly away. I want to know if you share with me, what's your definition of success?
Well, I've thought about it because you were so kind to send over some of the questions, which gave me the time to think about it. And I don't even know whether I've mentioned it in the book or not, but there is this book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. Stephen Covey.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of my favorites of all time. And then one of the habits is begin with the end in mind. And it's once again a little bit a morbid story, but you're dead. You're lying there, and then the people that you love are around you. And what do you want them to say? And reading that book gave me some peace of mind, because I'm a very chaotic person. And 10, 15 years ago, when I was working, I was unhappy because I was not with my family. When I was my family, I was unhappy because I had to do other stuff. So you run around, and if you get that idea, that helped me really a lot, of begin with the end in mind. Who are the most important people in your life, and what do you want them to say? And I would like to say my children, that I was a good dad, I did my best. And I would like to say my wife he was not a perfect, but he was a reasonably good man. You want your friends to say as a good person, colleagues, and then writing a book, making money, outperforming the S&P 500. Well, that's all nice, but that's not the most important thing. So being successful, and going one step further, and I'm really getting emotional on this, but how do you want to die? Well, I hope to die with a glass of champagne in my hand that's half full. My new book has just arrived. I know it's going to be good. And the people you love are around you, and you see that they're doing well. And then it's time to go. And that would be my definition of success.
I love the sound of that. We lost Charlie Munger last year, and I was thinking of all the books that were stacked next to his armchair the day he left us, the books he would never finish. And I always thought that it's a very inspiring thought to have still so many projects going on, that you're kind of busy living. And he was as busy living at the age of 99.9 as many of us are in our 30s, 40s, and 50s. So it's fascinating. And I think we live our lives too much out of fear, or the fear plays a big role. And I'll just mention what came to my mind. I thought of Jerry Seinfeld. You talked about the end of life, and he gave this talk at some point. He said that people would rather be in the coffin than give the eulogy, because we're so afraid of public speaking. And I think there was a bigger truth in that joke, that we are actually living out of fear. We talked about that clay from 5,000 years ago. We're so afraid about what's next, instead of actually living in the now. And the now is pretty special. So let's not let the fear push us into that coffin. Let's enjoy the day. Let's enjoy the years that we have, the time with family, time with friends. And I greatly enjoyed this conversation, and it was much deeper, much broader than I could have dreamed of. So I'm very, very grateful for this hour and a half with you, Philippe.
Thank you very much. It was, we've not spoken each other in the past, but you have a talent to let people tell stories that they did not even want to talk about. So that's a gift. So please keep doing that.
Thank you. I'm very grateful for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
You were listening to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest subject of all, money. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question: what it means to live a rich life beyond money. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment and follow, subscribe, rate, and share with friends and family. We rely on word of mouth to promote the show. One click for you means the world to us. Thank you. Until next time, your host, Bogumił Baranowski.